Welcome, my curious companions. Tonight, this story will gently walk you through the real science of why music gives us chills. By the time sleep finds you, you will understand the invisible threads that have always tied living things together through sound, and that familiar chill will never feel quite ordinary again. There is a moment, familiar and quiet, that arrives without warning. Maybe it happens on an evening like this one. The day finally settling around you, your body sinking into something soft, a blanket pulled a little closer, the low hum of the house going still. And somewhere in the background, almost at the edge of attention, a piece of music plays, something unhurried, something gentle. And then, without asking permission, a wave moves across the skin. A soft ripple along the arms, a barely there tightening at the back of the neck, the fine hairs rising one by one, as if the air itself had shifted just slightly, as if something in the room had changed without anything actually moving. It isn't cold. There is no wind. The room is exactly as warm as it was a moment ago. And yet something just moved through you, quietly, without effort, without any decision being made at all. There's something familiar about this feeling. Familiar not just in the sense that it has happened before, but in the way the body already seems to know it. The way it has always known it, long before there were words for it. No thought arrives to explain it. The skin simply responds. The tiny muscles at the root of each hair, muscles so small they rarely get named, with no known pathway for deliberate control, contract all at once. They pull those fine hairs upright like a soft field of grass catching a breeze that passes and is gone before it can be named. It happens the same way in every body. It has always happened this way. Beneath that small sensation, something much older is quietly at work. The nervous system, that vast and patient network woven through every inch of the body, is doing what it has always done. Translating sound into something physical, carrying it inward along pathways shaped over millions of years. And somewhere in that translation, gently and without announcement, the skin's own electrical properties shift in barely measurable ways. A change that passes without sensation, without any signal the mind would recognize, present only at the very edge of what instruments can detect. Nothing needs to be understood quickly here. It's enough to simply notice that the body hears music not just with the ears, but with the skin, with the arms, with the quiet surface of everything that faces outward toward the world. Rest inside that for a moment. The warmth of the blanket still around the shoulders, the stillness of the room, and that soft shiver already fading, leaving just the faintest trace of where it passed. There is a gentleness to wondering where this feeling came from. Not just tonight, but in the longest sense, across all the time that led to this moment. This same response, the hairs rising, the skin tightening, the quiet wave moving outward from somewhere deep, exists in other creatures too. And it has existed in people long before this particular evening, in rooms just as quiet as this one, in moments just as ordinary and unhurried. A dog's fur lifting along its back, a bird drawing its feathers close against the cold. The pattern is old, older than cities, older than language, older even than the soft music filling this room right now. And what's quietly worth noticing is that human skin carries far too little hair for any of the original purposes this response once served. And yet every small muscle remains, still intact, still faithfully contracting, still performing something the body no longer strictly needs. In those earlier, quieter times, a sudden shift in sensation meant something. The body didn't wait to think. It simply responded, making itself a little larger, holding warmth a little closer. And somehow, across all that time, the response remained. It softened, it found new surfaces. What once rose at the sound of movement in the dark now rises at the sound of a cello moving through a particular note in this body and in countless others, on evenings very much like this one. There is no need to decide what it means tonight. The blanket is still warm. The room is still. And somewhere just beneath the surface of the skin, something old and patient continues softly to listen. Sound, at its most essential, is simply movement. Not the kind of movement you can see, not leaves turning or curtains shifting in a draft, but something quieter than that, something invisible and continuous, rippling outward in all directions from whatever made it. A string drawn across another string, a voice finding its note in the dark. And then the air itself begins to move, not all at once, but in long, slow waves of pressure, gently crowding together and then spreading apart again, the way the surface of still water responds when something small and soft is set down upon it. Right now, in this quiet room, those waves are still moving. They pass through the air between walls, brush softly across the surface of the skin, travel the small distance to the ears without effort, without urgency, simply following the nature of what they are, which is motion, patient and continuous, the same motion that has moved through air and across skin for as long as there have been sounds and bodies to receive them. There's something worth resting in, just for a moment. The idea that sound is never really separate from the body. Before it is ever heard, it is already touching. The ear receives these waves at its outer edge, where its curved shape gathers them and funnels them inward, the way a cupped hand might collect water falling very slowly from somewhere above. The waves move through a narrow passage and press gently against a thin membrane stretched quietly across the dark. That membrane, small and patient, simply waits to be moved. And it is moved. Barely. Delicately. In ways so fine they carry no sensation, only the beginning of a sequence that continues inward. The same sequence unfolding in every listening body, in every quiet room, on every evening that has ever settled this gently into stillness. That first movement passes through a chain of the tiniest bones in the human body. 3 of them, each no larger than a grain of rice, each leaning softly into the next, translating the pressure of air into something the deeper structures of the ear can use. It happens in the dark. It happens in silence, at least from the inside. And none of it requires attention to continue. Beyond those small bones, the world of sound enters something softer still. A fluid-filled chamber, coiled gently like a small shell found along a quiet shoreline after the tide has gone out, receives the movement and carries it forward as a slow wave traveling through liquid. Lining its inner walls, arranged in careful rows, are hair cells, microscopic and impossibly fine, each one tuned by its position to respond to a particular rhythm arriving from outside. When the fluid shifts, they sway. Like grasses at the bottom of a shallow stream, bending without breaking, returning without effort. The same quiet motion that has been happening inside bodies like this one for longer than memory reaches. What's quietly worth noticing is that this same chamber, entirely on its own, sometimes generates its own faint acoustic emissions. Soft, nearly inaudible sounds that can be detected with sensitive instruments held close to a perfectly still ear. The ear, it seems, does not only receive. Where each hair cell bends, a signal begins. Small and precise, traveling inward toward the brain, carrying the shape of what arrived. The pressure and release, the rhythm, the particular quality of whatever moved through the air tonight. And alongside that, certain low frequencies appear to travel through bone and tissue rather than through the ear at all, reaching the nervous system along routes that bypass hearing almost entirely, arriving through the body itself, through the same body that has been here all evening, warm and still and quietly receiving. There's something familiar about that. The idea that the world does not wait for an invitation before it enters. It simply finds its way in, through whatever is open, through skin and bone and the small persistent structures of the inner ear, until what began outside becomes something felt from within. The blanket is still close. The air is still moving, gently, as it always has. The brain is always listening a little ahead of the moment, not dramatically, not with any urgency, but quietly, and almost without noticing, it leans softly forward into whatever is coming next. It gathers the shape of what has already arrived and begins, gently, to imagine what might follow. This happens with voices, with the sounds of weather shifting outside a window, with the familiar settling of a house going still at the end of the day. And it happens, perhaps most naturally of all, with music. With any sound that moves through time in patterns the body has learned, over years of quiet evenings just like this one, to recognize and follow. By the time a melody has offered a few of its notes, something in the mind has already begun to trace the path forward. Not consciously, not in any way that interrupts the simple, easy pleasure of listening. But somewhere beneath the surface of attention, the brain is doing what it has always done. Gathering, anticipating, quietly holding a sense of what the next moment might bring, the same way it has always done in every body that has ever sat still long enough to let a piece of music move through it. It's interesting to notice how much of the experience of music seems to live in that space between notes. Not in the sound that has already arrived, but in the brief, suspended moment just before the next one. There is a kind of leaning that happens there. A soft, almost physical sense of something approaching. And when the note arrives, when it lands where something wordless in the body had quietly expected it to, there is a release. Gentle and unhurried, like a long breath finally finding its end. Warmth settles into that release, something like ease, something like the particular comfort of being exactly where one has been many times before. Music, though, is never entirely predictable. Even familiar music holds small places where the pattern shifts slightly, where a note lingers longer or resolves in a direction not quite expected. And in those small moments of gentle surprise, something travels all the way to the surface of the skin. The same surface that rose earlier in the first quiet shiver of the evening, responding now to something different, and yet somehow the same. A molecule called dopamine moves through pathways threaded quietly through the brain, and it moves not only in response to things already received, but in response to things still approaching, still a fraction of a second away. It rises in anticipation. What's quietly worth noticing is that this response appears to arrive in two separate waves, one rising just before the expected moment, and another slightly different, when that moment finally lands or gently shifts from what was waiting for it. Two distinct movements, passing through the same system within the space of just a few seconds. Neither one announced, neither one visible from the outside. Happening now and in every other body that has ever leaned quietly into a piece of music on a still and unhurried evening. And alongside that, the brain regions most active during these moments of musical anticipation overlap considerably with those involved in processing trust and closeness. Not identical, but neighboring, as if music reaches the body through something older and more relational than the appreciation of sound alone, something that recognizes warmth even in an empty room. Nothing needs to be understood quickly here. The precise path from pattern to emotion is still being slowly and carefully traced, and there is something restful in that. In knowing that this ordinary experience still holds something not fully understood, that it has always held something not fully understood, and that this has never made it any less felt. The anticipation itself becomes the pleasure, not the arrival, but the approach. The suspended moment, the note still moving through the air, the body already beginning its quiet response, everything unfolding slowly in the dark. The same way it has unfolded in bodies just like this one, on evenings just like this one, for longer than anyone has thought to measure. The room is still. Something warm is close. Long before there was music, there was the body's need to respond. Out in the open world, under skies without city lights, in landscapes that carried no names, living creatures moved through environments that changed without warning. A sound arriving from an unexpected direction, a shift in the quality of the air that carried meaning before the mind had time to process it. A sudden stillness settling where there had just been movement. In those moments, the body did not pause. It did not wait for reflection to catch up. It simply acted quietly, completely, the same way it still acts now, on an evening that asks nothing urgent of it at all. The skin tightened. The fine hairs rose. Tiny muscles beneath the surface contracted all at once. the same tiny muscles that contracted earlier this evening in the first quiet shiver, pulling each hair upright in a motion that required no thought, no awareness, no decision of any kind. In creatures covered in thick fur, this had immediate purpose. The raised coat trapped warmth or briefly made the body appear larger in the low light of an uncertain moment. The nervous system sharpened. Something deeper than thought leaned forward, attending to the world with everything it had. What's quietly worth sitting with is that the signal traveling through the body to produce this response moves not along the slower, more considered pathways of the brain's outer layers, but through older and deeper structures, ones that were already ancient long before the capacity for language began to form. The body reaches its oldest systems first, before any reflection is possible, before any awareness has a chance to arrive. It has always worked this way. It works this way still. This response is very old, older than any instrument ever made. Older than the first sound shaped deliberately into something meant to be heard and felt by another. And yet here it is, still present, still moving through the body on a quiet evening like this one, arriving not as a warning, but surfacing gently when a piece of music reaches a particular place, when something in the listening self finds a pattern it cannot quite name and responds to it anyway. The way people have responded, in rooms and in open fields and under unfamiliar skies, for longer than memory reaches. Somewhere across the long stretch of time between that open landscape and this warm room, the world began slowly to change. The immediate urgency of uncertain terrain gave way, gradually and over more generations than can be imagined, to something more layered. Lives rich with memory and relationship, with the strange and specific pleasure of sound arranged into patterns that served no immediate survival purpose and yet somehow felt deeply necessary. Felt necessary in this body, and in every body that came before it, and in all the ones sitting quietly somewhere right now in rooms just as still as this one. The old responses did not disappear. They simply found new surfaces to move across. The nervous system discovering, without instruction, that music could reach those same ancient pathways. Not because a melody signals anything requiring action, but because something in the depth of the system does not always draw a clear line between what is threatening and what is simply, powerfully meaningful. And moving alongside all of that quietly, the immune system appears in certain conditions to shift its activity in small, measurable ways during moments of deep emotional response to music. Not dramatically, just present in the background, as if the body's many systems are more continuously in conversation with one another than daily life tends to suggest. As if the whole of the body is, in its quiet way, listening together. The chills that rose earlier this evening, those small ancient waves, traveled a very long road to arrive here. The mechanism remained, carried forward faithfully across all that time. Only the meaning shifted slowly over more time than the mind can comfortably hold. The body carries all of it without effort, without needing to be reminded. It simply responds, as it always has, as something in it, patient and old, always will. The room is still warm. The blanket is still close. There is something that happens when people gather around sound. Not something visible, not something that announces itself, but something quiet and gradual, unfolding beneath the surface of awareness, the way most of the body's most remarkable processes unfold. Without ceremony, without being noticed, until it has already been happening for some time. It begins the way warmth begins in a room. Imperceptibly from a single source, spreading until the air itself has changed and no one can quite remember when the change occurred. Rhythm has a way of moving outward from its source and finding the rhythms already present in whatever is near. Living systems tend, gently and without effort, to fall into step with the patterns moving around them. A heartbeat, steady and patient inside the chest, can shift its pace almost imperceptibly when a slow and even rhythm plays nearby. Breathing, which the body manages through every hour of the night without any instruction, can lengthen and deepen as music slows. Following a path quietly laid down by something outside, something that asked nothing in return. None of this requires effort. None of it requires awareness. And what's quietly worth noticing is that this same tendency moves inward as well. The brain's own electrical rhythms, cycling at their own natural frequencies, can drift gradually toward the tempo of a sustained external sound. Not completely, not rigidly, but enough that the line between the body's inner timing and the rhythm arriving from outside becomes, for a moment, genuinely soft and difficult to locate. The boundary that seemed so clear between inside and outside, the same boundary that softened earlier when vibrations moved through bone and skin before the ear had even registered them, softens again here in a different way, at a different depth. The body is always listening to its surroundings, always adjusting, always finding its way toward whatever rhythm is nearest and most continuous. When people share music, whether in the same room or across some greater distance, something similar moves between them. Breathing patterns begin to mirror one another. The timing of small physical responses aligns. And at the very edge of what has been observed, neural oscillations between a performer and a listener can begin to correspond in measurable ways, as though the sound carries something of the nervous system that shaped it, and the nervous system that receives it recognizes something and responds in kind. Not emerging, something quieter, something more like two systems drifting without knowing it through the same slow pattern. And perhaps that is where the shiver began long before this evening. Not in any single body, not in any single moment of music swelling toward something almost expected, but in the older, quieter fact of living creatures moving through the same air, responding to the same sounds, their skin rising and settling in patterns that were never entirely their own. The same air that carries sound carries the body's response outward again, into the room, into the space between one person and another, thinning as it travels, softening, becoming something less like a signal and more like a texture. The texture of an evening that has been felt before in other rooms by other bodies, along the same unhurried pathways. The music continues somewhere beneath attention now. The skin is still. The fine hairs have settled. Somewhere in the deep interior, fluid moves in its slow and patient chamber, hair cells swaying in their dark and private current, translating what arrives into something the body already knows how to receive. The air still moves, softly, as it always has, carrying what it carries, touching what it touches, passing through rooms where people have always sat quietly in the evening, waiting without knowing they were waiting, feeling without knowing what it was they felt. A ripple along the arms, a barely there tightening, something old and continuous, still moving. With that, I'll leave you in the quiet embrace of the night. May your thoughts feel lighter and your rest arrive with ease. Until the next quiet, why?